Marianne Ashworth had stopped listening for her husband's step on the gravel 3 years before, and told herself she had stopped minding it, which was the larger of the two lies. It cost her nothing anyone could see, which was, she had found, the particular cruelty of that kind of cost. The physic garden at Rain Court held the morning the way a cupped hand holds water, careful and about to lose it, and the air smelled of crushed feverfew and wet brick, and underneath, the mineral coolness of a summer that had not yet decided whether to turn to storm. She knelt among the borders with her sleeves pinned back and her hands green to the wrist, and she did not look up when the church clock in Ashcombe struck the half-hour, because she had long ago stopped counting the hours by anything but her own reckoning, which stood this particular morning at 3 years, 1 month, and 11 days. She kept the tally the way her mother had taught her to keep accounts, exact to the day, though she had never once said the number aloud to a living soul. In her sewing box in the blue room upstairs, folded flat beneath a paper of pins, lay a strip of ribbon the colour of a dove's throat, soft with handling, its edges gone soft and grey. It was worth, in any coin a person could name, nothing at all. She had tied it, as a girl of 9, between her own wrist and her grandmother's, in a garden very like this one, so that the old woman would not have to feel a child's hand closing over hers like a keeper's, and could instead simply follow the small tug of it through the roses, as though she were leading and not being led. Her grandmother had gone blind the slow way, the way a room goes dark when no one troubles to light the second candle, and Marianne had learned, long before she learned Latin or her letters properly, how a person could be guided without ever once being made to feel guided. She thought of this now only because Bess had asked her, over breakfast, whether she meant to throw the old ribbon out with the rest of the pin-box rubbish, and Marianne had said no, rather too quickly. And Bess had looked at her the particular look she kept for when Marianne said a thing too quickly. Bess had known her since she was a squalling infant in Josiah Colville's cloth-smelling house in the north, before there had been a duke in the picture at all, and she had followed her south to this cold grey house, without once being asked twice. A house stands on the hands that stay in it, Bess liked to say, not the name carved over its door, and she had first said it to Marianne on her wedding morning, not as comfort exactly, but as instruction, the way she might have told her which shoes would blister by noon. Marianne had needed the instruction. His Grace, the Duke of Rain, had married her in a chapel full of his own relations' silence 4 years before, had walked her up the aisle of it like a man walking to a creditor's office, and on the first night of their marriage, in the cold good room that was to be hers for the rest of her life, he had told her, without any cruelty in his voice at all, which was itself the cruelty of it, that he could not love her, had not asked to marry her, and did not intend to pretend otherwise for her comfort or anyone else's. She had been 18. She had said nothing, because there had been nothing to say to a man being honest with her, for what she later understood was the first and last time in years. She had gone on being useful instead. She ran his house better than his mother had run it, doctored his tenants when the parish surgeon would not come out for a chest cough in the rain, learned the name of every soul on the home farm, and the ailment of half of them, and he had thanked her for none of it in any word she could carry to bed with her at night, only in the fact that the house continued, unremarked, to run. Her father had died 2 years into it, of an apoplexy at his counting-house desk, and with him had gone the last person in the world who might have written to ask whether she was happy. She had told herself she did not need asking. That was the second lie, the larger one's twin, and she was still turning it over like a coin worn smooth on both faces, when the sky over the home farm went the colour of a bruise, and the first fat drops came down on the cold frames, and a boy came running from the stables, with his cap already soaked through, shouting for someone, anyone, to fetch the doctor. Because his Grace's horse had come back to the yard without him. She was on her feet before Bess had finished crossing herself. They found him at the ford below Long Meadow, thrown clear of the mare when she shied from the thunder, his head against a stone half sunk in the swollen water. And it took 4 men and a hurdle gate to carry him back up the hill through rain that had gone from warning to violence in the space of a single half-mile. Marianne walked beside the hurdle the whole way and did not let herself run, because Bess had taught her that too, once, long ago, that a woman who ran drew every eye in the yard to her fear, and a woman who walked drew none. She held that discipline the way she held most things now, the way she set a full glass down on an uneven table, slowly, and with both hands, and by the time they had got him into the blue room and sent a man on the fastest horse left in the stable for Dr. Fenwick, her hands had stopped shaking entirely, which she noted with a kind of distant, useless pride, as though she had achieved something rather than simply survived the first quarter-hour of it. Prynne was already in the hall when she came down for dry linen. Mr. Silas Prynne had managed the Rain estate accounts for 19 years, first for the old Duke and now for the young one, and he stood at the foot of the great stair with a candle and an expression of exactly the correct gravity. And he told her, before she had asked, that he had taken the liberty of sending word to Mr. Thaddeus Ashworth in town, in case matters should require a settled hand while his Grace was indisposed. She had thanked him. She had not, in that first ruined hour, thought to ask herself why a man's cousin should need sending for, before the doctor had so much as named the injury, and it was only very much later, turning the evening over, as she turned everything over now, in the dark, alone, that she understood she had heard the first note of the whole business, and mistaken it, in her fright, for kindness. Doctor Fenwick came at midnight, soaked through the shoulders of his coat, and was an hour with the Duke behind the closed door of the blue room, while Marianne sat in the passage on a hard chair, with her hands folded in her lap like a woman at a strange church, and when he came out at last, he looked at her for a long moment before he spoke. The way a man looks at a patient he is deciding how much to tell. The blow to the head, he said, was a serious one, and there was swelling behind the eyes that time alone could answer for, and until it went down there was no saying with any honesty what his Grace would or would not see when he woke. He woke 2 days later, in the grey hour before dawn, and the first sound in the house was not a cry of relief, but a very quiet, very controlled voice asking, of the dark around him, why no one had thought to light a candle, when in fact 4 candles burned within arm's reach of the bed, and had burned all night. The days that followed took on the strange, muffled quality of a house wrapped in wet wool, every ordinary sound arriving late and softened. The blue room was kept dim on Dr. Fenwick's instruction. The heavy curtains, drawn against a light his Grace could no longer use, and did not wish to be reminded he could not, and Marianne found herself, within a week, the person who crossed that threshold oftener than anyone else in the house, not because he asked for her, he asked for no one, but because someone had to see that the fire was banked correctly, and the broth came up hot, and the physician's bitter drops went into him on the hour, rather than whenever a housemaid remembered. He did not thank her for any of it, in the beginning, and she did not expect it, because gratitude had never been a coin he spent freely even before his eyes had gone dark, and she had long since stopped keeping a ledger of what she was owed in that particular column. What she had not expected was how the darkness changed the shape of him. He had always held himself like a man arranging a room for a guest who was not quite welcome, correct at every seam, warm nowhere, and she had assumed, in her private and rather bitter imagining, that blindness would strip that arrangement away and leave something rawer underneath. Instead, it seemed only to draw the correctness tighter, as though he had decided that if the world could no longer see him fail to feel a thing, he would at least feel nothing worth hiding. He asked after the accounts in a voice of perfect composure. He asked whether the hay had come in dry. He did not ask whether she had slept, and she noted, with the same distant pride she had felt on the night of the accident, that she no longer minded the omission, or told herself she did not, which came to the same thing in practice. It was Bess who found her sitting with her sewing box open on her knee one evening, the grey ribbon lying loose across her palm, and said nothing about it at all, only set down the mending basket and remarked, in the tone of a woman discussing weather, that a blind man new to his blindness generally walked into every piece of furniture in a room before he learned its shape by memory, and that a length of ribbon between two wrists had never yet been thought an insult to anybody's dignity, provided nobody made a great show of offering it. Marianne had gone up the next morning with the ribbon knotted loosely round her own wrist, and the other end looped, before she had entirely decided to do it, round his where it lay on the counterpane. And he had gone very still under her hand, the way a man goes still when he is deciding whether to be offended. "What is this?" he said, and his fingers had found the soft worn grain of it before she could answer, turning it once between thumb and forefinger the way a man reads a coin in the dark to know its value by feel alone. "A guideline," she told him, "so that you need not put a hand on the wall or on a servant's sleeve to cross your own bedchamber." He had been quiet long enough that she thought he meant to have it untied, and set aside like every other unwanted kindness she had offered him across 4 years, and then he had said, in a voice with none of its usual polish on it, that it would do, and had not let go of the loop of it even after she rose to leave the room. It became, over the following days, a small daily ceremony neither of them named. She tied it each morning and untied it each night, and in between he crossed the blue room, and, once his strength returned enough to permit it, the length of the gallery beyond, with the ribbon's small tension telling him what a cane or a servant's arm could not. That someone walked a half-pace ahead who did not intend to let him fall. He asked her, on the 4th morning of it, where such a habit had come from, and she told him, because there seemed no reason not to, about her grandmother and the roses, and the particular indignity of being led by the hand like a child. He said nothing for a moment, and then he said that his own father had gone the last 2 years of his life nearly deaf, and had refused every remedy for it out of pure stubbornness, preferring to have the whole county think him rude rather than admit the world had grown quieter around him, and she understood, hearing it, that this was the closest thing to an offered confidence she had been given in 4 years of marriage, and she did not know what to do with it, except to receive it carefully, the way one receives a thing that might yet be withdrawn. It was the nearest thing to peace either of them had allowed the other in 4 years, and it lasted exactly as long as it took for a servant to knock with word that Mr. Prynne begged a moment of her ladyship's time below, a matter concerning the tenant Wicks's rent arrears that could not, he was told to say, comfortably wait for morning. She went down and found Prynne mild and apologetic and entirely reasonable, laying out a proposal that struck her, in her tiredness and her wish to keep the fragile new quiet of the house intact, as sensible enough that he continue managing the day-to-day accounts exactly as he had these 19 years, without troubling his Grace, who had enough to bear, or herself, who had the sick-room and the household both on her hands, with the small arithmetic of rents and wages and repairs. She agreed to it gladly, gratefully even, because it seemed a mercy offered rather than a door quietly closing, and it was only very much later that she understood she had just handed the one man in the house with something to hide the exact freedom he had been angling 4 years and 2 conversations to secure. It was on the 6th morning, with the ribbon newly tied and the gallery window throwing its grey early light across the floorboards, that she saw him turn his head very slightly toward that window, as a man turns toward warmth he can feel on his skin, which told her nothing she did not already know a blind man might do. What she noticed, and set aside without understanding, because she had not yet any reason to look for it, was that he stepped around the low bench that stood in the gallery's exact centre, without the ribbon's tension warning him of it at all. Word of a duke struck blind travels faster down a county's lanes than any postboy, and by the 2nd week Rain Court had begun to receive the particular attention a great house receives when its master can no longer see who comes and goes in it. Mr. Thaddeus Ashworth arrived from town on the 9th day, a large, affable, watchful man, some 10 years the Duke's senior, who embraced his cousin with real warmth and spoke, within the hour, and with every appearance of reluctant duty, of the need to see the estate's affairs put on a settled footing while matters remained uncertain, so that no one should suffer for want of a signature his Grace could no longer safely give. Mr. Prynne, who stood at his elbow throughout this speech with the candle-steady composure of a man who has rehearsed being asked exactly this question, agreed that some temporary arrangement touching the power to sign and to receive would be only prudent, and suggested, with every appearance of reluctance, that Dr. Fenwick's written opinion as to the likely permanence of his Grace's condition would be the proper foundation on which to build it. Marianne, standing rather to one side of this conversation as a wife, is generally permitted to stand rather to one side of business conversations, felt the floor of the room tilt very slightly under her, though nothing in the words themselves had been improper, and she understood, without yet being able to say why, that she had just watched 2 men lay the first stone of a building whose shape she could not see. It was in this same week that Mr. Edmund Hale began to call, a widowed gentleman farmer, whose land marched with rains along the western boundary, and who had known Marianne, in the ordinary neighbourly way, since her first year in the county, and who now came, he said, only to ask whether his Grace's condition permitted a friend's company, and to bring a basket of the early plums his own succession houses had forced ahead of the season. He was easy company, unhurried and plainly spoken, and he made her laugh once, quietly, over something so small she could not afterward remember what it had been, and she was still smiling when she came back into the hall and found Prynne watching her from the foot of the stair, with an expression that arranged itself into courtesy a half-breath too late. His smile reaching the room a full breath before it reached his eyes, and leaving it long before the rest of his face had finished with it. Neighbours are a comfort in a difficult season, he said, and something in the mild flatness of the observation told her it was not a comfort he intended it to be received as. The talk in Ashcombe, when it reached her at all, reached her second hand, through the miller's wife or the surgeon's daughter, dressed up as concern for her poor situation, married to a man now shut up in the dark with no comfort but his accounts and his cousin, and it was no great leap, the talk implied, for a young wife so situated to find comfort where comfort was offered. She had said nothing of this to the Duke, because there seemed no way to say it that would not sound either like a confession or an accusation, and she carried it instead the way she carried most things, quietly, at the back of her own reckoning. It was Bess who put the shape of it into words one evening while unpinning Marianne's hair. "A house stands on the hands that stay in it," she said again, not for the first time, "but there are them as would rather burn the house down than see whose hands they are." And Marianne had looked at her in the glass and asked plainly whether she meant Prynne, and Bess had only gone on with the pins and said that she meant whoever the cap fitted. The private wound came out that same week, though not by design. The Duke had asked her, in the low unguarded hour after his supper, whether she found the county talk difficult to bear, and she had answered, more honestly than she had meant to, that she had borne harder things from closer quarters, and before she could soften it he had asked what she meant by that, and she had told him, at last, in a voice she kept very level because she did not trust it otherwise, that she had never forgotten the words he had said to her on the first night of their marriage, that he could not love her and would not pretend to, and that she had spent 4 years learning to need nothing from a man who had told her plainly, and honestly she would grant him that much, that there was nothing to be had. He was silent long enough that she thought she had finally driven him past the limit of what even his composure could absorb, and when he spoke at last his voice had none of its usual polish left on it at all, only a low, worn plainness she had not heard from him since before their marriage. "I remember what I said," he told her. "I have remembered it every day since, which you will not believe, and I do not ask you to." The room held that admission the way a held breath holds a room, and neither of them moved to fill the silence after it, and it was into that silence that Prynne knocked and let himself in without properly waiting for an answer, papers under his arm, to observe that the light was failing, and that certain letters wanted signing before the evening post went out, and the moment closed over as quietly and completely as water closing over a dropped stone. The two-hander that followed came a fortnight later, on an evening when the household had gone early to bed and the Physic Garden's cracked old sundial stood catching the last grey light through the gallery window, a thing that had kept no reliable hour in a generation, and yet stood exactly where it always stood, patient and useless, and somehow steadying to look at. Marianne had gone up to see the fire built before she retired, and found him not abed but sitting by the window, with his face turned toward the garden he could no longer, by his own account, see. And something in the stillness of him made her stay rather than withdraw. She asked him, since the door of that other conversation stood open, and neither of them had troubled to shut it, why he had married her at all, if he had known from the first he could not love her, and he was quiet a long while before he answered, turning the signet ring on his smallest finger a half-turn, and back, and a half-turn again, the way she had come to notice he did when a thing cost him more to say than his voice let show. The estate was drowning, he told her. His father had left debts he had not understood the size of until the old man was in the ground and past explaining them, and Prynne, who had managed the accounts for 20 years and knew every figure in them better than the family did, had brought him the reckoning himself, gently, almost with regret, and had told him there was no honest way through it, but a marriage that brought money rather than land, since land brought only more mortgage. He had been 23, and proud in the particular ruinous way of young men who have just discovered that pride is the one thing left to them that cannot be repossessed, and he had gone to the altar with a cloth merchant's daughter the way a man goes to a creditor's office, as she herself had once described it, though she had not known until this moment that he had felt precisely the same shame from the opposite side of it. "I told myself I was sparing you an illusion," he said. "I have since had 4 years to discover that a spared illusion is not the same mercy as a spared wound, whatever I believed at the time." She told him, in return, what those 4 years had cost her, plainly and without ornament, because he had earned plainness by offering it first, the long labour of making herself useful in a house that had not asked to be improved, the tally she had kept without meaning to of every unanswered kindness, the particular loneliness of sharing a name with a man who barely troubled to share a table. He listened to all of it without once turning his face from the window, and when she had finished, he said only that he did not know how to be forgiven for 4 years by a woman he had wronged in the first hour of the first one, and she told him, with more honesty than comfort, that she did not know either, and that perhaps neither of them needed to know yet, only to go on being honest a day at a time and see what grew from it. The way one waits to judge a planted thing, not by pulling at its root, but by what shows itself, in time, above the ground. It was the nearest thing to peace either of them had allowed the other in 4 years, and it lasted exactly as long as it took for a servant to knock with word that Mr. Prynne begged a moment of her ladyship's time below, a matter concerning the tenant Wicks's rent arrears that could not. He was told to say, comfortably, wait for morning. She went down and found Prynne mild and apologetic and entirely reasonable, laying out a proposal that struck her, in her tiredness, and her wish to keep the fragile new quiet of the house intact, as sensible enough that he continue managing the day-to-day accounts exactly as he had these 19 years, without troubling his Grace, who had enough to bear, or herself, who had the sick-room and the household both on her hands, with the small arithmetic of rents and wages and repairs. She agreed to it gladly, gratefully even, because it seemed a mercy offered rather than a door quietly closing, and it was only very much later that she understood she had just handed the one man in the house with something to hide the exact freedom he had been angling 4 years, and 2 conversations to secure. It was a wet Tuesday some weeks on, with the whole county gone stubbornly rainless despite the season's early storm, the ground gone hard and pale as bone under a sun that seemed to have forgotten how to be merciful, when Marianne sat down at the estate desk to settle a small account of her own, the apothecary's bill for the tenant Wicks's boy, whose chest had never properly cleared since the spring, and found tucked between 2 receipts that ought to have matched and did not, a figure she could not make sense of. The sum paid out for the summer's hay carting exceeded, by a margin too large to be a clerk's error, the sum the carter himself. A plain honest man named Tull, who had done the work for the Rain estate for 30 years, had told her only that week he had actually received. She sat with the 2 papers side by side for a long while, the way one sits with a wound one has only just discovered, testing it gently to see how deep it runs, and she said nothing to anyone that evening, only lay awake turning the discrepancy over the way she turned everything over now, in the dark, alone. It was Dr. Fenwick, calling the following morning to look at his Grace's eyes by the strong north light Marianne had begun, without quite admitting to herself why, to insist upon for the examinations, who gave her, without meaning to, the shape of what she was looking for. He was an old man grown comfortable in his long acquaintance with the family, blunt where courtesy would have served him better, and kind underneath the bluntness, and while he waited for his instruments to be fetched, he told her, apropos of nothing beyond his own long memory, of a soldier he had treated as a young surgeon's apprentice, who had gone, by every outward sign, entirely paralysed in his right hand the month before his regiment was to embark, and had recovered the full use of it within a fortnight of his father's death, the commission having been his father's dearest wish and not remotely his own. The body hides what the will cannot bear to show openly, Fenwick said, tapping the side of his own skull with one blunt finger, and it hides it so well the man himself often does not know he is hiding it, not until the reason for the hiding is taken away. And how would a person know? Marianne asked him, keeping her voice as level as she set a full glass down on an uneven table, whether a thing so hidden had already begun to mend. Watch what he reaches for before anyone tells him where it stands, Fenwick told her, packing his bag with the brisk unconcern of a man who has just handed over something valuable without noticing its weight. A man who has truly lost his sight reaches for the world the way a beggar reaches for coin, uncertain and grateful for whatever guidance comes. A man whose sight is returning begins, before he knows it himself, to reach the way a man reaches who already knows roughly where the thing will be. She thought of the low bench in the gallery, and the window he had turned his face toward as though he could feel its light, and had, perhaps, seen more of it than light alone. She began, from that morning, to watch him properly, not as a wife tends a husband, but as she had once watched a fevered tenant for the particular flicker of the eye that told her whether the crisis was breaking toward life or away from it, and within 3 days she had her answer, given to her not by any single proof, but by a dozen small ones laid end to end. The way he no longer waited for the ribbon's small tug before a doorway he could not possibly have relearned by touch alone. The way his hand had gone, once, unthinking, straight to a teacup set down an inch from where the housemaid usually set it. She did not confront him with it. She sat instead with the 2 mismatched carting receipts still folded in her workbox beside the grey ribbon, and she understood, with a clarity that felt less like discovery than like a long-delayed arrival, that there were 2 separate deceptions living under one roof, and that she would need proof enough of both before she trusted her own voice to speak of either. The proof, when she went looking for it properly, did not come easily. She began with the ledgers themselves, borrowing the excuse of the tenant Wicks's account to ask Prynne, with every appearance of idle housewifely thoroughness, whether she might look over the summer's carting entries for her own satisfaction, and he had produced them for her with such ready, unhesitating courtesy that she understood at once she was being shown exactly what he wished her to see, and nothing more. It was Mr. Hale, calling again with a basket of late plums, and an easy willingness to talk of anything at all, who gave her the thread she needed, without knowing he had given her anything. He had mentioned, in the idle way one mentions county gossip, that Prynne had lately purchased a parcel of freehold land 2 parishes over, a tidy little property well beyond what a land agent's salary, however generously reckoned across 19 years, might reasonably be thought to stretch to. She asked Bess, that same evening, whether the old clerk who had kept the estate books before Prynne's time, a Mr. oldest long since pensioned off to a cottage on the Ashcombe Road, might still have his wits about him, and Bess allowed that he had buried 2 wives and outlived a great deal of gossip about himself, without once losing the sharpness of his memory for figures. It was Aldous, over a pot of tea in his small close parlour, who told her, with the freedom of a man who no longer feared for his place, that the debts the old Duke had left behind had been real enough, but nothing like so ruinous as young Mr. Prynne, new to his authority then, and eager to prove his usefulness to a grieving family, had represented them at the time, and that he, Aldous, had said as much once to his own cost, and been quietly pensioned off within the 12-month for his trouble. She went to Prynne herself after that, not in anger, because anger would have told him more than she wished him to know, but with the same mild, careful courtesy he had always shown her, and asked him plainly whether the figures of 19 years before had been quite so desperate as the family had been told. He did not deny it outright. He was too intelligent a man for outright denial, and he gave her instead a long, reasonable, almost regretful account of the difficulty of managing a great estate through a careless old duke's final years, of the necessity of impressing upon a proud young heir the gravity of his situation before that heir would consent to any remedy at all, of how a little exaggeration in a good cause was surely no crime against a family he had served faithfully for 2 decades. "I am not cruel," he told her, setting his hands flat on the desk between them in a gesture that looked, for all the world, like honesty. "I am arithmetical," which the young mistake for cruelty because they have not yet learned that a house cannot be run on sentiment. He suggested, gently, that a young woman new enough to the county might do well not to trouble old ground long settled, that questions asked too loudly about the family's affairs tended to reflect worse on the family than on whoever had managed them, and that he would, of course, be glad to open every book in his charge to her at any hour she chose. It was a threat delivered so courteously she was 3 streets from the house before she recognised it fully for what it was. That night, unable to sleep, she went down to the estate office herself, telling the one footman still awake that she had left her work-box there, and let herself into Prynne's own locked desk with a key she had kept, unremarked, since the days when she had first come to Rain Court, and been given the run of every room in it as its new mistress. In the bottom drawer, beneath a false floor of blank paper that gave way too easily under her thumb, she found a second ledger, kept in the same careful hand as the first, recording, in figures that matched nothing in the household's official books, 20 years of small skimmed sums grown, compounded and patient, into a fortune, and beneath it, folded together, 3 letters in Thaddeus Ashworth's own hand, discussing, in the polite oblique language of men confident no one honest would ever read them, the advantages that might follow, for both correspondents, should his Grace's blindness prove, on Dr. Fenwick's honest medical opinion, a permanent condition requiring a settled guardian for the estate's affairs. She read the letters twice through by the light of a single candle before she trusted herself to move, and it was while she sat there, the second ledger open on her knee, that she understood the full shape of what 19 years of one man's patience had built, and understood too, with a coldness that had nothing to do with the night air, that the marriage forced upon a proud young man and a frightened girl by an invented crisis had been the first brick of it, laid before either of them was old enough to know they were being used as mortar. She went to find the Duke at once, before her nerve could fail her, and found him not in the blue room, but in the gallery, standing very still by the window with the grey ribbon, untied for the night, coiled loose in his hand, and she saw, before she had said a single word, that his face had already begun to compose itself into the arrangement she knew so well, the coat cut for a taller man, correct at every seam and warm nowhere, and something in the particular deliberateness of it told her, before she had even opened her mouth to speak of Prynne, that he had heard her step in the passage and known, by the sound of it alone, exactly who approached and how near. She stopped in the doorway. "You can see me," she said, and it was not a question. He did not deny it, which was, she thought afterward, the one mercy he allowed her in that whole ruined half-hour, and he told her, in the flat, unornamented voice of a man laying down a burden he has carried too long to trust himself with the manner of setting it down gently, that his sight had begun returning within the fortnight, faint shapes first and then edges, and then, within a month, nearly the whole of it, and that he had said nothing, to her or to anyone, because he had wanted, once, in his life, to know who stayed by a man who could offer them nothing in return for it, and to know it without the answer being softened by anyone's awareness of being watched. "I did not think you would forgive it easily," he said, "when I did tell you. I see I judged that correctly, at least." She told him, then, of the ledger still open under her arm, of Aldous and the plums, and the false crisis, and the letters in Thaddeus's hand, the words coming out of her faster and flatter than she meant them to, and she watched something go out of his face that she had never once seen leave it in 4 years, the last of its careful arrangement, and it was in the middle of her own sentence, the ledger's damning figures still half-spoken, that the gallery door opened without a knock, and Prynne stood in it, his candle throwing his shadow long up the panelling, his eyes going first to the ledger in her hands, and then, with a stillness far more telling than any cry of alarm, to the Duke's face turned directly and unmistakably toward his own. Whatever mask Prynne wore for the rest of the county, he did not trouble to wear it now, and the silence that followed held every one of them fixed in it, the Duke seeing perfectly well for the first time in the man's presence since the accident. Marianne with the proof of 19 years' patient theft open in her 2 hands. And Prynne, courteous still, terribly courteous, saying at last, in a voice gone very quiet, that it appeared a great deal had been decided that evening without the courtesy of consulting him. What followed in the days after was not, as she had half feared it might be, an open war, but something colder and more careful, which frightened her more. Prynne withdrew that same night with a composure that told her he had long ago planned for this precise contingency, and by morning word had reached the house, through channels Marianne could not trace, and did not doubt he had arranged, that certain persons of standing in the county had begun to whisper, not of embezzlement, which he was too clever to let anyone speak of first, but of the Duchess's frequent private meetings with Mr. Hale during her husband's incapacity, meetings that might, in careless mouths, be made to sound very unlike the neighbourly visits they had been. It was Dr. Fenwick arriving that same afternoon and finding the household in an uproar he did not yet understand, who offered, once the full shape of the business had been laid before him, the tidy way out that Marianne came, in time, to think of as the moment she learned exactly how much the truth would cost her to insist upon. Let the whole matter be settled quietly, he suggested, his long friendship with the family plainly speaking through him. Let Prynne be eased from his post with a generous pension, and his silence brought along with it. Let the business of the marriage's true origins stay buried where it had lain for 19 years. Let the county go on believing what it had always believed, that a great house had weathered a difficult season and come through it whole. No one need be ruined. No one need be shamed. She had wanted for one entire evening to take that offer with both hands, because it asked so little of her beyond a silence she was already well practised in keeping. But it was Bess, of all people, who put into words what she had not yet found the courage to say herself, that a house stands on the hands that stay in it, not the name carved over its door, and that a lie kept for the comfort of a name was still, in the end, only a lie, and would sit under the floorboards of Rain Court exactly as Prynne's false ledger had sat in his desk drawer, waiting its turn to come up through the boards again in 20 years' time, in some other frightened girl's hands. Marianne said as much to the Duke that same night, plainly, without softening it for his comfort or her own, that she would not spend the rest of her life keeping a second silence to protect the shame of the first, and that if he wished the truth told, it must be told properly, before witnesses, so that no one afterward could reshape it into whatever shape suited them best. He heard her out and said, at the end of it, in the flattest and most honest voice she had yet had from him, that he had spent 4 years believing honesty was a thing a man of his position could not afford, and that he was only now beginning to understand it had been the one thing, all along, that might have saved him the cost of everything else. It was in the same conversation that he told her, gently and with a care that very nearly undid the whole of her hard-won composure, that he meant to release her from any further obligation to nurse a scandal not of her own making, that she might go to the dower house at Ashcombe with a settlement generous enough to make her entirely her own mistress, and need never again be touched by whatever came next. He meant it, she understood later, as the one true kindness left in his power to offer, a door held open rather than a door closed. She heard it, in the raw state 4 years of unanswered kindness had left her in, as the oldest wound reopening in a new shape, the same man telling her again, in gentler words, that she was not wanted for herself, only spared out of duty, and she left the room before he had finished speaking, and did not trust herself to go back to it that night, or the next, packing instead, in a kind of numb and furious efficiency, the small number of things in that house she could truly call her own. A work-box, a mother's recipe book, a length of grey ribbon folded flat beneath a paper of pins. The hearing, when it came, 3 days later, was Dr. Fenwick's idea in the end, though it was Mr. Hale who gave it its proper teeth. Word had reached him, through the same county channels that carried everything eventually, of the whispers being made of his own visits, and rather than retreat from them as a lesser man might have done to spare his own name, he came instead to Rain Court himself, and asked, with a bluntness Marianne had not previously suspected in him, that whatever business was to be settled properly, in daylight, before enough witnesses that no whisper could survive the telling of it. It was held in the long library on a morning after a night of hard rain had at last broken the summer's drought, the windows thrown open on air rinsed clean and cool, and every person with a claim upon the truth of the matter was gathered there. Thaddeus Ashworth arrived post-haste and plainly uneasy. Dr. Fenwick standing by the cold hearth with his hands clasped behind him. Bess just inside the door where a lady's maid had no proper business standing and stood anyway. Mr. Hale near the window. And Prynne himself, composed to the last, seated as though he had been invited as an honoured guest rather than summoned as the accused. Marianne laid the second ledger on the long table herself, and Aldous' own signed account beside it, and the 3 letters in Thaddeus's hand beneath both, and asked that they be read aloud, all of them, so that everyone present should hear the same words at the same moment, and carry away no version of the story but the true one. It was the Duke who read them, standing at the table's head with his sight restored and undisguised now before the whole room. His voice level through figures that named, entry by entry, 19 years of small thefts grown enormous, and through his own cousin's careful phrases discussing what might be done should a blind duke require, on a physician's honest word, a settled guardian. Thaddeus went the colour of tallow, and began, haltingly, to protest that he had understood the arrangement quite differently, and no one troubled to press him further, because it was plain to every eye in the room that whatever he had understood. He had understood it comfortably enough not to ask too many questions. It was Prynne who broke first, and broke in exactly the manner Fenwick's old parable had promised, the body giving away what the will could not admit. When the Duke reached the entry recording the purchase of the freehold 2 parishes over, and Prynne came half out of his chair. One hand already extended toward the ledger, as though 20 years of habit could still, in that instant, make it his to close. He caught himself before he had crossed the table, and sat back, and the small, violent honesty of that single lunge told the room more plainly than any letter could have done exactly who he was. When he spoke at last, it was without the smile that had always arrived a breath ahead of his eyes, and what he said, in a voice gone suddenly old, was that he had begun the business 20 years before to save an estate a careless father was bleeding to death by inches, and had told himself, every year since, that he was owed some small measure of what he had preserved, and that he supposed, hearing it read back in another man's voice, that this was exactly the reasoning of every thief who had ever lived, and that he did not expect, and did not ask, to be believed innocent of it. He rose, when Dr. Fenwick asked him to, with what dignity remained to him, and inclined his head to the Duke, a soldier's courtesy between men who had, in their own way, each once served the same house faithfully, before he was shown to the door and out of it, and out, within the week, of the county altogether. It was Mr. Hale, in the quiet that followed, who spoke next, stating plainly, for every ear in the room, that his visits to the Duchess had been exactly what they appeared, the calls of an old neighbour upon a household in trouble, and that any tongue that wished to make more of it might apply to him directly for satisfaction, a challenge delivered with such easy, unhurried decency that it drew, from somewhere near the window, the first small laugh the room had allowed itself all morning. He caught Marianne's eye once, briefly, as the room began to empty, and what passed between them was not regret exactly, but the clean mutual acknowledgment of a road neither of them would after all be walking, and he bowed over her hand and took his leave with a joke about the plums so dry and so entirely his own that she found herself laughing properly, for the first time in days. At the door of an emptying room, she found the Duke alone afterward in the Physic garden, standing by the cracked old sundial, as though its useless face might, for once, tell him something true. And she came to stand beside him, without either of them speaking for a long moment, the rinsed morning air smelling of wet earth and feverfew, the way it had smelled on the morning the whole of it began. He told her then, plainly, without the coat cut for a taller man to hide behind any longer, that he had never once, in 4 years, believed himself worth the loyalty she had shown him, and that the blindness, once it came, had seemed to him almost a mercy, an excuse to test whether that loyalty was real, or only duty, worn thin and patient, and that he had never expected, going into the darkness of it, to find that it was real, or to find how much the discovery would cost him in shame at having doubted it at all. He said, too, in the same low, unornamented voice, that he withdrew every word of the first night of their marriage, not to unsay it, because a thing once said cannot truly be unsaid, but to set beside it, plainly, that he had been wrong, and had known himself wrong for longer than he had had the courage to admit it. She told him she would accept that, but not without terms, because she had learned across 4 hard years that a happiness accepted without conditions was only another silence waiting to be kept. She wanted, she told him, an end to secrets kept for either of their comfort, whatever the cost of speaking them. She wanted her own work among the tenants acknowledged, rather than merely tolerated, since it had never once been a shame to her, and she did not intend to treat it as one now. And she wanted, before anything else, that he never again decide alone, out of some idea of sparing her, what she was strong enough to be told. He agreed to all three without argument, which surprised her less than it might once have done, and he reached for her hand, and she noticed, because she had watched his hands so closely for so many weeks, that his thumb did not once turn the signet ring at his smallest finger, not that morning, nor any morning after, because there was nothing left, at last, for the gesture to hide. They were married again, in the small chapel, before the harvest was in, not because the law required it, but because both of them seemed to feel the first ceremony had been made under false witness, and wanted a true one to stand beside it, and Bess wept through the whole of it, and denied it fiercely afterward. A year turned, and then the better part of another, and on a gold-lit afternoon in early autumn Marianne knelt again in the physic garden among borders gone heavy with seed, the cracked sundial throwing its long useless shadow across the path, and a small girl of not quite 2 years sat propped against her skirts, gumming at a strip of ribbon the colour of a dove's throat that had once guided a blind woman through a different garden, and a blind man through this one, now knotted loose and safe around one small determined wrist, so she should not crawl off toward the beds of foxglove. The Duke came out to them across the grass, without any stick or guiding hand at all, his sight whole, his step certain, and he lowered himself down onto the warm stone beside his wife and his daughter, and said nothing for a long while, only watched the child worry the old ribbon between her fingers, and Marianne, watching him watch her, thought that a house built on hands that stay does not, in the end, need very many words to hold it up, only the willingness to keep offering them. And that is where we will leave them, in the last of that gold afternoon, with the sundial telling no time at all, and neither of them minding. If this house held you a little while tonight, stay by the fire a moment longer before you go out into your own evening. Think of Bess's plain small sentence about the hands that stay, or the ribbon passed from one blind grandmother's garden all the way down to a child too young yet to know what it had carried, and tell us, if you would, which moment stayed with you longest, because it helps this fire keep burning for the next traveller who finds it, and staying close to use Sati H channel _name GE is the surest way to be here when it's lit again. There is another story waiting its turn on the hearth, another set of doors about to open in the dark, and we will have the kettle on for it. Until then, sleep gently, and be kind to whoever is waiting for your step on the gravel.